Look, I'm not saying I'm an anarchist, but if there's a form that can be technically followed while still setting fire to the spirit of the law, you bet I'll use it. This all started with a simple bucket of paint, specifically Sunrise Citrus, a color that apparently committed a felony against the HOA's delicate retinas. My name is Leo Maxwell, mid-30s, and I work in marketing, which means I spend my entire remote workday inventing euphemisms for "we didn't hit our numbers." You'd think my home life would be a little less theatrical, right? Wrong. I live in the preserve at Whispering Pines, which sounds like a luxury wildlife refuge, but is actually just 400 houses crammed onto a former swamp in the Sunbelt, policed by a lady named Mrs. Beatrice Cunningham, who I suspect runs on pure, weaponized indignation. I bought the place 2 years ago. It's a nice little ranch house, very generic, very builder-grade beige. It blended in so well you couldn't find it on a cloudy day. I figured, hey, I'm a creative guy. I need a little pop. After submitting 3 paint chip samples that were, frankly, aggressively boring, and having them all rejected for reasons like lacks gravitas or suggests inappropriate frivolity, I went rogue. Well, mostly rogue. I picked a color called Sunrise Citrus. Now, listen, this wasn't neon orange. It wasn't radioactive yellow. It was a warm, slightly vibrant, yet objectively pleasant yellow-orange. The color of a decent glass of fresh squeezed juice, maybe. It screamed, "I enjoy life, but I also pay my taxes." The painting crew finished on a Tuesday. The house looked fantastic. It was the only house on the street that didn't look like it was waiting for the end of the world. I sat on my newly painted porch with a beer, admiring my work, feeling like I'd just solved world peace. That feeling lasted exactly 48 hours. On Thursday morning, I found a crisp, tri-folded violation notice tucked into my mailbox. It wasn't a polite suggestion. It was a goddamn summons. The headline was in all caps. Notice of violation. Aesthetic disruption. Immediate remediation required. I grabbed my phone and shot a picture of the violation to my best friend, Chad, who lives in a downtown apartment where the only rule is don't let the rats borrow your laptop. Me. Guess who's got 2 thumbs and is officially a menace to society? Chad. Did you finally get that pet tiger? Me. Worse. My paint color, Sunrise Citrus, is apparently disruptive to the neighborhood harmony. See attached. Chad. LMAO. That's just orange. It looks like a nice day. Me. In the Kingdom of Cunningham, happiness is a capital offense. I have 14 days to repent and repaint or face daily fines. I read the violation again. The language was beautiful in its bureaucratic absurdity. It said the hue exceeded the acceptable luminosity index for residential facades and displayed a lack of appropriate visual subtlety relative to the common area standards. It was signed by Mrs. Cunningham, president of the HOA board, who clearly had way too much free time. My first thought was to fight it, hire a lawyer, start a petition. But then I looked out the window. My neighbors' houses were all variants of beige, putty, tan, and taupe. My house looked like a tropical fruit stand in a field of dry toast. The sheer, exhausting energy required to argue taste with people who willingly chose a color called desert dust just wasn't worth it. Then, the second thought arrived. It was slow, cold, and utterly magnificent. If they demanded compliance, I would give them compliance. If they wanted a color that met their exact soul-crushing criteria for subtlety, I would give them a color so subtle it would make the neighbors weep with aesthetic grief. I didn't want to fight the rule. I wanted to use the rule as a weapon. I leaned back in my chair, swiveled around to my giant desk monitor, and started pulling up the HOA's full governing documents. Deep within the 80 pages of drivel, past the rules about bird feeders and holiday lights, was a section that spoke to me, a section on approved materials for utility structures and non-facade amenities. It dictated the use of neutral, non-reflective, non-distracting industrial shades. A devilish, perfect plan began to form. I was going to give them the most technically compliant, most aesthetically offensive color imaginable. The battle wasn't over. It was just shifting from the color wheel to the spreadsheet. The next 2 days were dedicated to deep state aesthetic espionage. I didn't just skim the bylaws, I internalized them. I became one with the covenant, conditions, and restrictions, known locally as the CCRs. I found the section I needed. Or 4.2.b, Aesthetic Neutrality Mandate. This mandate governed things like electrical boxes, generator sheds, and those hideous plastic utility screens. The key phrase was shades of gray, brown, or off-white that are non-reflective, highly saturated with carbon pigment, and intended to blend with the natural background or surrounding infrastructure. The legal loophole was staring me right in the face. My entire house was surrounding infrastructure. I started Googling industrial colors. I looked at server racks, shipping containers, and factory floors. I needed something truly depressing. I needed the color of a cubicle farm at 3 a.m. Then, the marketing manager in me kicked in. I thought about project timelines, mandatory meetings, and the universally soul-crushing tools of corporate existence. I found it. The perfect color. It was a specific, dense, dull, bluish-tinted battleship gray, often used in institutional settings. I christened it Gantt Chart Gray. This wasn't just gray. This was the color of ambition dying in a spreadsheet. It was the aesthetic equivalent of Monday morning, perpetually. I had the color mixed at a specialty industrial supply house, specifically requesting a non-reflective, high-carbon pigment base. The result looked like wet cement mixed with resignation. It was beautiful. Now for the next part, making the HOA approve it. I couldn't just submit Gantt Chart Gray. I had to package it with a level of bureaucratic jargon that would short-circuit Mrs. Cunningham's internal monologue. I drafted a formal response to the violation notice, 3 pages long, printed on heavy stock paper, and complete with footnotes. Memorandum to the HOA Board of Directors. Violation Notice, number 23401B. Leo Maxwell, 1421, Whisper Trace Way. The key excerpt. In adherence to the board's directive, the existing Sunrise Citrus facade, identified as being outside the acceptable luminosity index, ALI, range, will be fully remediated. After an exhaustive analysis of the CCRs, specifically referencing 44.2.b, Aesthetic Neutrality Mandate, I have selected a high saturation, low reflectivity hue to establish a precedent of superior compliance. The chosen color, designated Gantt Chart Gray, PMS equivalent, neutral 788C, low velocity pigment, offers optimal compliance due to its documented ability to minimize visual distraction and maximize integration with the surrounding structural and natural elements. It is submitted herewith as Exhibit A, Approved Remedial Facade Sample. The color actively mitigates visual stimuli, ensuring the property's aesthetic contribution is minimal. aligning perfectly with the board's established goals for visual subtlety. I stapled the ridiculously dull paint chip to the letter and marched it over to the HOA management office, which was nestled right next to the pool, adding a layer of tragic irony to the whole operation. The admin, a college student named Brenda, just looked at the 3-page memo and sighed. "This looks like a lot, Leo," she mumbled, clearly hoping I'd just repaint it beige like everyone else. "It is," I confirmed, with the grave sincerity of a man finalizing a peace treaty. "It is the sound of one homeowner strictly adhering to the letter of the law." I waited. I knew the HOA had 7 days to respond. I spent that week watering my lawn in a state of suspended animation, watching the mail slot like a hawk. Finally, on day 6, the email arrived. The subject line was terse. Architectural Review Committee, ARC, Approval, 1421, WTW. I ripped it open. It was from Mrs. Cunningham, but the tone was stiff and formal, clearly vetted by the management company. "Dear Mr. Maxwell, the Architectural Review Committee has reviewed your submission, Exhibit A, and accompanying memorandum. While the board finds the descriptive language unconventional, the submitted color sample, Gantt chart gray, falls within the acceptable range for non-facade utility structures as defined in 4.2.b of the CCRs. The ARC grants conditional approval for the repainting of the primary structure facade only. Please ensure the project is completed within 30 days. Conditional approval. They approved the color. They were so blinded by the jargon and the sheer grayness of the sample, they couldn't possibly reject it without admitting their whole code was based on personal preference. They'd walked right into the trap. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. I had the official, signed, sealed, and delivered approval to turn my cheerful, citrus-colored home into a monument to bureaucratic misery. It was time to call the contractors. This needed to be a professional job. The vengeance had to be high quality. With the official conditional approval email printed and framed, a slight exaggeration, but I did pin it to the wall, my next mission was procurement and execution. I needed 3 things: the exact depressing paint, a contractor willing to apply the exact depressing paint, and a sense of theatrical timing. First, the paint. I needed the industrial-grade, non-reflective base that made this color feel more like a municipal water treatment plant than a home. I drove back to the specialty supply house. The guy at the counter, a veteran named Gary with tired eyes, looked at the can I'd brought back. "Leo, you brought back the custom neutral 788C. You sure you want 30 more gallons of this? This is what they use inside shipping containers." "Gary," I said, leaning conspiratorially over the counter, "I am engaged in a very specific, high-stakes aesthetic compliance project. This color is not about what I want. It's about what I am required to use by a higher power." Gary just shook his head, looking unimpressed. "It's a house, man. Just paint it tan. Nobody's forcing you to buy the color of economic recession." "Ah, but they are," I countered. "They have approved the concept of this color. To deviate now would be to admit frivolity. This is serious. I need those 30 gallons, and I need the receipt to say clearly, Gantt chart gray, low-velocity pigment. I need documentation, Gary." He printed the receipt with a theatrical sigh. Gantt chart gray. Check. Documentation complete. Next, the contractors. This was the fun part, explaining the aesthetic vision, or lack thereof, to professionals. I interviewed 3 local painting companies. Contractor number 1. Mr. Diaz, Diaz and Sons Painting. Mr. Diaz was old school, a real professional who took pride in his work. He looked at the sample chip and then at my cheerful, albeit condemned, Sunrise Citrus house. "Okay, so you got the notice, right?" Mr. Diaz asked, squinting. "We can fix this. I got a lovely stone wall cream that is board approved. We can get it done next week." "Mr. Diaz, I appreciate that. But no, the board has already conditionally approved this color," I explained, holding up the depressing gray chip. He took the chip and turned it over in his hand like a small, sad tombstone. "This? What is this? This is not exterior grade residential, son. This is the color they use on the inside of a safe. It's Gantt chart gray," I corrected gently. "It's high carbon, non-reflective, and perfectly compliant with the CCR's mandate for non-facade/utility structures." "But your house is a facade," he protested, waving his arms. "The entire point of painting is to make it look nice. Look, buddy, I've painted prisons brighter than this sample. Are you okay? Did your wife leave you for a structural engineer?" "I'm perfectly fine," I insisted, forcing a cheerful smile. "I am simply future-proofing the property's compliance metrics. I require a quote for professional single-coat application of the approved Gantt chart gray." He shook his head, gave me a ridiculously high quote, and then left, muttering something about the death of taste. He was too honest for the job. Contractor number 2, Seamless Solutions, Inc., a young, apathetic millennial. Seamless Solutions sent a guy named Tyler, wearing sunglasses indoors and texting constantly. He barely glanced at the house. "Yeah, so, a repaint, got it. 2 coats, latex, or acrylic?" Tyler asked, never looking up from his phone. I slid the giant, labeled paint chip across the hood of my car. "Industrial base, 1 heavy coat. The color is Gantt chart gray." He finally lowered the phone, looked at the chip, and then looked at my house. He paused for maybe 4 full seconds. "Is this a joke?" "No, it's a compliance measure," I replied. "The HOA rejected my Sunrise Citrus, so I am going with a shade that is optimally compliant. I need you to understand that precision is key. This isn't just gray. This is project management pale, mixed with workflow shadow. Are your guys up to handling a high-stakes, purely bureaucratic aesthetic mandate?" Tyler shrugged, adjusting his sunglasses. "I mean, it's just paint, man. Easier than trimming hedges. As long as the check clears, we'll paint it purple and polka-dotted. You're the customer." Tyler's apathy was exactly what I needed. No moral objections, just a quote. I hired him immediately. I also made a side trip to a printing shop. I needed professional, high-grade black vinyl lettering, not spray paint, not a handwritten sign. This had to look official. It had to look like a permanent, intentional piece of property documentation. I got 2 sets of lettering, one for the house itself and one for the mailbox. The plan was locked. Tyler's crew was scheduled to start on Monday. I informed the HOA, via email referencing the ARC approval date, that remediation was commencing on the 17th, thereby starting the clock on their self-inflicted misery. The night before the painting started, I sat on the patio, drinking a final celebratory beer, looking at my vibrant orange house. It was a beautiful rebel that was about to sacrifice itself for a greater cause, a martyr to the mandatory aesthetic. "Don't worry, buddy," I whispered to the facade. "You're going to a good place. A very, very boring place." I felt a surge of pride. I hadn't just secured a building permit. I had secured a weaponized color palette. The battle of the beige had officially begun. Monday morning dawned with the quiet expectation of suburban life, shattered by the sound of industrial paint compressors. Tyler's crew, efficient and completely unmoved by the existential dread they were about to spray, got to work. I positioned myself on the front porch with a laptop, pretending to be utterly engrossed in a Q3 performance report, but really, I was just watching the show. This was better than cable. The transformation was immediate and jarring. The warm sunrise citrus was consumed by the flat, dense, soul-crushing Gantt chart gray. It was the color of a concrete bunker on a foggy day. It didn't just absorb the light, it seemed to actively repel joy. When the sun hit it, it didn't gleam. It just looked dry. It was the absolute, perfect anti-color. Within an hour, the first rubberneckers started appearing. Mrs. Cunningham's neighbor, a woman named Carol, who wears a visor even indoors, walked her meticulously groomed golden doodle past my property 4 times, each time slowing down to an almost imperceptible crawl. She looked like she was watching her dog walk into the sea. A few cars actually stopped. A guy leaned out of a pickup truck and shouted, "Hey, you running some kind of military surplus depot now?" I waved cheerfully from the porch. "Nope, just achieving maximum compliance with CCR FAWARI 4.2.B. He just squinted, shook his head, and drove away. The climax of the day came when I installed the vinyl lettering. I peeled the backing off the professionally cut letters and applied them meticulously to the house fascia, right next to the garage, where they were large, legible, and impossible to ignore. The first set read, "Property hue, Gantt chart gray." The second set, placed directly below it, "Status, board-approved boring. Compliance rating, 100%. It wasn't a joke, it was a caption. It provided context for the atrocity, and it used their own administrative language against them. I then affixed the smaller, equally professional labels to the utility boxes and the mailbox post, mandated neutral zone 1. The reaction was swift. It started with frantic, whispered phone calls on the sidewalks. Then the inevitable. My phone rang. Caller ID. HOA management. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, an email dropped from Mrs. Cunningham herself. Subject: immediate demand for signage removal. Violation. Mr. Maxwell, while the color Gantt chart gray was conditionally approved, the added signage stating board-approved boring is highly inappropriate, insulting to the community, and constitutes an unauthorized external decoration, in clear violation of OR 6.1.a, decorative element restrictions. You must remove the vinyl lettering immediately. I typed my response immediately, with the speed and precision of a caffeinated legal assistant. Dear Mrs. Cunningham, thank you for your timely feedback. However, I must respectfully disagree with your classification. The vinyl lettering is not decorative under the definition of OD 6.1.a, e.g., wreaths, flags, seasonal items. This lettering constitutes necessary aesthetic documentation, providing transparent status updates regarding the structure's compliance history following the initial violation notice. It is essential property information, much like a house number or a contractor's sign during active remediation. Furthermore, board-approved boring is a factual statement confirming the property's alignment with the CCR's aesthetic neutrality mandate. I look forward to your specific written documentation explaining why a factual status update is defined as a prohibited decorative element. Until then, the documentation remains. Send. I leaned back, feeling the sweet burn of professional sarcasm. The climax of the afternoon was when Carol, the golden doodle walker, actually approached me. She looked genuinely distressed. "Leo, darling," she said, her voice laced with neighborhood concern. "What have you done? That color? It looks like a recession. And the sign. You're making a spectacle." "Carol, hi," I said cheerfully, sipping my sparkling water. "I've achieved optimal compliance. The board told me my house was too bright and disruptive. I have replaced disruption with maximum visual subtlety, a shade so neutral it cancels out light. The sign simply confirms that this aesthetic tragedy was approved by the people who run this neighborhood." She stammered. But it lowers property values." "Does it?" I challenged gently. "Or does it simply provide documented proof that the board's standards, when strictly followed, result in the most depressing outcome possible? Either way, my paperwork is immaculate. Talk to Mrs. Cunningham. She signed the approval for the gray." Carol retreated, defeated, pulling her golden doodle behind her. I knew she was heading straight to Mrs. Cunningham. The seeds of internal conflict were sown. My house, once a beacon of citrus hope, was now a drab gray billboard for bureaucratic irony. The HOA, realizing they had been utterly defeated on the color issue, doubled down on the signage. They sent a formal, official cease and desist letter, claiming the lettering was defamatory to the governing body and was now considered a public nuisance. I knew what was coming next. External pressure. I was right. 2 days later, a patrol car, not an HOA private security car, but an actual official municipal police car, pulled up to the curb. I watched from my office window, rubbing my hands together. This was the moment I'd prepared for. I stepped outside just as Officer Johnson, male, tired eyes, mustache, and Officer Martinez, female, clipboard, looked vaguely amused, were getting out of the car. "Afternoon, gentlemen, ma'am," I greeted them calmly. "Can I help you? I hope this isn't about my lawn height. I just measured it this morning." Officer Johnson sighed, clearly having dealt with one too many HOA disputes. "Sir, we received a call regarding vandalism and public disturbance, specifically the sign on your property." He gestured vaguely at the board-approved boring lettering. "Vandalism? Public disturbance?" I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Officer, I can assure you that everything you see here is fully compliant with all municipal codes. This is not vandalism. This is a professionally applied vinyl graphic." Officer Martinez stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "The complaint states the language is offensive and creates a hostile environment for neighbors and the governing board." I smiled sweetly. "Officer, with respect, the statement 'board-approved boring' is simply a factual affirmation of the aesthetic mandate outlined in the covenants, which they themselves approved. If the board finds boring to be offensive, that's an issue of self-reflection, not a public disturbance." I walked over to the mailbox post and retrieved my file, which included the initial violation notice and the RC approval for the color. "Here," I said, handing them the documents. "This is the original violation that called the old color disruptive. And this is the signed approval for the new color, which is designed to be highly non-disturbing, or by logical extension, boring. The lettering is merely providing the property's compliance status." Officer Johnson thumbed through the documents, his face getting flatter with every page of HOA legalese. He looked at Officer Martinez, who was trying hard not to smirk. "Sir," Johnson said slowly, "the city doesn't regulate homeowner association internal aesthetics or signage that merely comments on internal association business, unless it violates a clear public safety or obscenity ordinance. This is not obscene." "It is only boring," I confirmed. Martinez closed her clipboard. "Mr. Maxwell, unless you are blocking a fire hydrant or using hate speech, we really can't intervene in an HOA dispute. The sign, while unusual, is not a police matter. We recommend they pursue this through their civil channels." Johnson handed my file back. "Have a good day, sir. And maybe, for your own sake, try not to paint anything in bureaucratic brown next." I watched them drive off, feeling an enormous sense of satisfaction. The HOA had played the cop card and lost, but Mrs. Cunningham wasn't done. The next day, I received a notice that the HOA had contacted the Municipal Code Enforcement Office, claiming the paint itself was not to code. Specifically, they were arguing it violated fire safety standards because the industrial base was allegedly too flammable or toxic. This forced a second, even more bureaucratic interaction. The code enforcement officer, a serious middle-aged man named Frank, showed up in an official city vehicle. Frank was all business. "Mr. Maxwell, I need to verify the material safety data sheet, MSDS, for your exterior facade coating. We have a complaint alleging non-residential flammability ratings." "Frank, please come in," I said, leading him to my desk. I had been waiting for this. I pulled out a 3-ring binder. "My pleasure," I said. "You see, when they demanded aesthetic neutrality under 4.2b, which governs utility structures, I knew they were essentially demanding an industrial grade of coating. I anticipated this exact challenge." I flipped to a heavily highlighted section of the binder. The Gantt chart gray is applied using a low-velocity pigment, high solids polyurethane enamel. Note here on the MSDS, Frank, fire retardancy rating, Class A, far superior to the standard latex most homes use. It's also low VOC, which is better for the environment. Frank looked at the chemical breakdown, then at the fire rating. He was clearly trying to find a loophole, but I had closed them all with superior paperwork. "So the paint is actually more resistant to fire than the neighborhood standard?" Frank asked, defeated. "Significantly," I confirmed. "I chose compliance and safety. It's a win-win, provided you don't mind the visual resemblance to a submarine." Frank stood up, shaking his head slowly. "Mr. Maxwell, your paint is compliant. Your signage is a civil matter. I am filing a closed case report. You have satisfied all municipal code requirements." He walked out, utterly bewildered by the level of calculated bureaucratic revenge he had witnessed. I realized the HOA was officially trapped. They couldn't use the police, they couldn't use city code enforcement, and they couldn't change the color because they had approved it. My legal passive-aggressive masterpiece was complete. But the final act was still required, the emotional climax. I needed to face the board. It was time for the show. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for a Thursday night at 7:00 p.m. in the community center. The subject on the agenda was ominously titled, "The 1421 Whisper Trace Way Architectural Review Violation and Subsequent Actions." I arrived fashionably late, about 5 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to start. The room was packed. People I'd never seen before were there, motivated purely by neighborhood outrage. They were packed into those cheap plastic chairs, bathed in the fluorescent glow of the community center, looking like an angry, beige-clad jury. Mrs. Cunningham was at the head table, flanked by the vice president, Mr. Peterson, a man who looked permanently stunned, and the secretary, Janet, a woman who just wanted to talk about pool hours. Mrs. Cunningham's face was the color of my old sunrise citrus, but for entirely different, rage-filled reasons. She hammered the cheap plastic gavel. "Mr. Maxwell, thank you for joining us. We will now address your property. The board acknowledges the color was technically approved. However, the subsequent actions, the labeling, the nature of the hue itself, the contact with local law enforcement demonstrate a clear pattern of bad faith intended to defame the board and disrupt the community's desired ambiance. She then launched into the testimonials, a ridiculous parade of neighbors complaining. "It makes my morning walk depressing," cried Carol. "I can't sell my house now. The gray is visible in the listing photos," yelled some guy named Kevin. "It looks like an abandoned warehouse," wailed another resident. When it was finally my turn, I walked to the front, carrying only a single, large poster board that I carefully placed on an easel. The title was bold and clear. A Case Study in Compliance. The Board-Approved Boring Project. "Good evening, board and fellow homeowners," I began, adopting my calmest, most boring corporate voice. "I want to thank the board for forcing this necessary review of our aesthetic standards. This entire project, from the Gantt chart gray paint to the board-approved boring signage, is a testament to the board's commitment to strict compliance with the CCRs." I pointed to the poster, which had 3 key points listed. Violation. The board issued notice that Sunrise Citrus was too bright and disruptive. Remediation. I submitted and received written approval for Gantt chart gray, citing 44.2b, aesthetic neutrality mandate. Status. The current facade meets the mandate for non-distraction, achieving the highest possible rating for subtlety. Mrs. Cunningham interrupted, her voice tight with fury. "Mr. Maxwell, you know this is about your attitude and the signage. It's defamatory." "Defamatory?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Mrs. Cunningham, please read the approved covenant section regarding decorative elements, RD 6.1.a. Does this text, which uses the word boring as a factual observation of the color's non-distracting nature, fall under the same category as a flamingo or a holiday banner?" I held up the police report. The city police, whom the board called, confirmed this is a civil matter of documentation, not a public disturbance. I held up the code enforcement closure notice. The city code enforcement, whom the board called, confirmed the paint is, in fact, Class A fire retardant and fully compliant. I paused for the dramatic finish. The motion before the board, I assume, is to repeal the color approval, but I urge you to consider the precedent. If you repeal an approval simply because you dislike the aesthetically compliant result, you effectively admit to 2 things. 1, your approval process is arbitrary, and 2, the CCR's definition of aesthetic neutrality is legally indefensible. I have the signed approval, the detailed receipts for the Gantt chart gray pigment, and documentation showing every step of my compliant process. I followed the letter of the law. To fine me or force a repaint now would be an act of capricious behavior that would expose the HOA to a significant lawsuit over the cost of the paint, the labor, and my legal fees. I bowed slightly. "Thank you for allowing me to create the preserve at Whispering Pine's single most compliant property." The room was silent. You could hear the sound of the board members' internal organs seizing up at the mention of the word lawsuit. Mrs. Cunningham glared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped fish. She looked at Mr. Peterson, who just shrugged, utterly defeated. The final motion was put to a vote. Motion to repeal the RC approval for 1421 Whisper Trace Way. Mrs. Cunningham. Yes. Mr. Peterson. Abstain. Janet. No. Wait, yes, no, I just want to talk about the pool hours. The vote was inconclusive and legally problematic. The board, faced with the certainty of spending HOA money on lawyers to fight a homeowner who was technically 100% right, quietly voted to table the issue indefinitely. I had won. The most depressing victory possible. The night of the board meeting was the true climax. After the vote to table the issue indefinitely, bureaucratic speak for, "Oh God, we're scared to touch it," I walked out of that community center feeling lighter than air. I had won the war by proving their own rules were a weapon against them. The great gray house of 1421 Whisper Trace Way remained. It stood on the street, a monument to administrative overreach. It made the taupes look cheerful and the beiges look like a party. The neighbors, once furious, slowly retreated into an awkward silence. They didn't like the house, but they seemed to grudgingly respect the sheer audacity of the execution. I was no longer the flamboyant idiot with the orange paint. I was the terrifying lunatic who had read the CCRs and weaponized Chapter 4.2 to B. My reputation was now based on my ability to wield paperwork like a katana. Mrs. Cunningham and I maintained a relationship of exquisitely professional contempt. She would glare at me from across the street, and I would give her a polite, knowing nod. We were two cold warriors, respecting each other's ability to maintain the passive-aggressive standoff. My final act of defiance was subtle. I hired the vinyl sign guy to come back one last time. This time, the lettering was small, subtle, and placed strategically on the back of my mailbox post, facing the street. It read, "Aesthetic warning. Approach with low expectations." It was just small enough that it clearly fell outside any signage restrictions, but large enough that anyone driving by got the message. I look out the window now. The house is still Gantt chart gray. It has a dull, satisfying permanence to it. I spent nearly $3,000 on industrial paint, legal printing, and 2 sets of contractors, all to prove a point about a color I didn't even want. Was it worth it? Absolutely. The cost was trivial compared to the sheer, unadulterated joy of watching Mrs. Cunningham's face when I pulled out the fire safety data sheet. That, my friends, is priceless. It taught me an important lesson about American suburban life. It's less about living and more about strategically navigating paperwork. If you're going to be governed by a set of ridiculous, overly vague rules, the only way to retain your sanity is to follow them so precisely that they choke on their own bureaucracy. You have to be the ultimate rules lawyer. You have to be technically correct, which is the best kind of correct. I am now dedicating my spare time to researching the maximum legally permissible height for a fiberglass flamingo statue under the category of portable lawn ornaments. You know, just to keep the bureaucracy sharp. The preserve at Whispering Pines may be boring, but my compliance is about to get a whole lot more tall. My battle with the beige continues. Stay tuned.